a Western scientist, Western specialist of neurophysiology, and a Buddhist monk. And we have seen that the Western scientist was defending a position which can be characterized broadly as materialist or physicalist, namely that he believes that somehow consciousness arises from a material basis. On the other hand, we had a Buddhist monk, Matthew, who defended a very different position. But I think it's very important to notice that the contradiction against the materialist position doesn't come only from a Buddhist tradition. There are only many Western thinkers that are against this position and have good arguments against it. So I wish to present some of their arguments, some of the Western arguments against materialist picture of consciousness. So my title is, Does Consciousness Have a Material Basis? The usual idea that consciousness has a material basis is asymmetrical. You immediately feel the dissymmetry. There is something which is basic, which is obvious, which is given to us, palpable, solid, which is matter, more basic than anything else, and then you have something derivative that comes from it, something a little bit strange called consciousness. How is it that material processes give rise to consciousness? My point is that, in fact, this asymmetry between, this asymmetrical view of the relation between matter and consciousness is completely wrong. And at any rate, it's not supported. It's not even supported by the best fact we have. So, first of all, I will ask that. Is the view that conscious experience derives from a material basis? So, is it true that science supports the idea that conscious experience derives from a material basis? It's indisputable that the very method of science tends towards this idea. Why? Because scientists are entirely concentrated on their objects, and their objects are material objects that can be seen from the third-person point of view. Therefore, they tend to think that it's the most fundamental thing of all, just because their method is converging towards these objects. Yet, apart from this issue of method, there are no absolutely convincing arguments in the favor of the idea that consciousness derives from a material basis. First of all, let me state the apparent consensus. The apparent consensus is that indeed it's the case that conscious experience derives from a material basis. For instance, there is Chris Koch in 2004 who said the entire brain is sufficient for consciousness. There is Dan Dennett, who is even stronger in his claim, who said consciousness is a physical, biological phenomenon like reproduction. Okay, they have, of course, these scientists who claim that have some arguments. They notice that there are strong and very narrow correlations between mental events, especially consciousness contents, and the working of the brain. They claim also, they say, and they are right, that using these correlations, we could even perform thought reading, namely putting some electrodes there, we could know what a certain person is thinking. For instance, it's maybe thinking of an apple, or it's maybe thinking of a tennis court, or anything like that. And we can say that by way of some electrodes or any other device. There is another argument, even stronger maybe. It's that the fact that we can stimulate certain parts of the brain and obtain certain very specific experiences, very specific contents of consciousness. And there is also the fact that one can predict, for instance, by means of a certain electroencephalograms, what is the probability that a certain person who is in coma or in a vegetative state wakes up. So all these arguments seem to be compelling. Yet there is widespread doubt in spite of these arguments. For instance, there is Gerald Edelman, a great and important neurologist, who noticed that describing a certain neural process is not living it. It's not living the experience that goes with it. It's not possible, for instance, to connect in a narrow and very precise way the description, abstract and structural description of a brain process with an experience. There is a gap between the two. You could have any brain process you wish, and yet you have absolutely no, in principle, argument to think that they should be associated with a lived experience. So much so that many philosophers of science of the West have imagined the thought experiment of a zombie. A zombie is a being that behaves exactly as we do, except for the fact that he or she has absolutely no experience of that. This is a logical possibility which is not precluded by anything in our science. Another person who seems to doubt about that is Chris. In a short sentence that I picked out in his last book, I saw this that made me, warm my heart. Christoph Koch, yes. So he said that subjectivity is too radically different from anything physical for it to be an emergent phenomenon. I entirely agree with him. Now let me see more closely these arguments in favor of material basis of consciousness and show that they are not good arguments. For instance, correlation. The fact that there is correlation between brain functioning and certain contents of experience. Well, one should be very clear that correlation doesn't mean automatically causation. For instance, of course, a correlation can be the sign that there is a causal relation between A and B. It could be the case that the correlation between brain functioning and conscious events is the sign that there is a causal connection between the brain functioning and the contents of consciousness. But it can also be so many other cases. For instance, it could be a case of reverse causation, namely the contrary, conscious events that cause brain events. For instance, you can give a beautiful example of this idea of reverse causation. Let's suppose that you see that each time there is a big fire, you see many firemen. And then some people could deduce, because of the correlation, that it is the firemen who are causing the big fire. But of course, we all know that it's not the case, that it's the contrary, and that it's the big fire that attracts, so to speak, the firemen. Okay, it could be the case. So this is just to illustrate the possibility of an elementary mistake of logic when somebody says, because there is a correlation between brain and consciousness, therefore there must be a relation of causality between the two things. Now, you could also have a case of bidirectional causation, namely not the brain is causing consciousness, but the brain is causing consciousness and consciousness is causing the brain, or the brain and consciousness are dependently co-arising. This is, I think, closer to the Buddhist view. You could also have a case of common cause, namely, it's not that consciousness and brain are cause of one another, but that both are caused by a third factor. For instance, let's suppose, I will give an example once again. Let's suppose that you are in a starry night. In a clear night, you see many stars, and it's very cold. And somebody a little bit naive says, oh, I understand. That means that the stars are bringing cold, that the stars are the cause of cold. But obviously it's not the case. The correlation between the starry sky and the cold is due to a common factor, which is the night. The fact that it's a night, there is no sun, and therefore no heat. Okay. You could also have a fourth possibility, which is that neither A nor B, neither consciousness nor brain is the cause of one another, nor are they caused by a common factor. You could have the case which was described by William James, in which he said, brain and consciousness can be described as two sides of the same coin. One is described from one side as concave, and the other side is described as convex. And the relation between between consciousness and brain is not a causal one, but just the two sides of the same coin. So there are so many possibilities to explain or to understand these correlations that have nothing to do with one causing the other. Of course, you could say, oh, but I have maybe Chris could tell me, I have another argument, which is even more powerful than correlation. It is that I can trigger events, conscious events, by means of a transcranial electromagnetic stimulation. One can do that, indeed. And if we retain the definition of cause by Galileo, we see that indeed this counts as a cause. The cause, he said, is that which, when posited, the effect follows, and when removed, the effect is removed. And it's true the case. When we effect this transcranial stimulation, we have an effect. We have experience, a certain content of experience. Is it the proof that consciousness is caused by a brain process? Here again, it's not. Because to be a proof, you should have only one-way causation. Whereas, as everybody knows here, and especially Your Holiness, you know that there is brain plasticity, that there is possibility of mental training, and therefore there is possibility of downward, reverse causation from a mental activity to a brain process. Therefore, here again, transcranial stimulation is no proof that brain process is the cause of consciousness. So I skipped this one because it was just rehearsing the same ideas with an example. And I go to something which is more than an argument. I think it is better than an argument. It's an evidence, and a glaring evidence. Well, you know that according to materialists, what is given, what is here, what is obvious and fundamental is matter. It's the bodies. Now, let's make a little experiment together. I see in this direction, and I see a table. This is a material body. I see in this direction, and I see an armchair. This is a material body. I see in this direction, and I see a statue of the Buddha. This is a material body once again. I close my eyes, and I feel sensations of my body. This is an experience of a certain material body, which is my body. Now, what is common to everything, to all of these events? What is common to all of these events is experience. Experience of the table, experience of the chair, experience of the statue of the Buddha, experience of my own feelings of the body. Experience is everywhere. What is more glaring and more obvious than material bodies is experience. Experience of them, or experience full stop. And this is exactly what Francisco Varela was claiming very strongly. He said, Lived experience is where we start from and where all must link back to, like a guiding thread. We start from experience. We start our inquiry about material bodies, about brains, about everything from experience, inside experience. This is the most basic fact. And Chris Koch seems to agree. He said, without consciousness, there is nothing. Here again, we are in complete agreement. Now, so I agree with Chris, once again, but I think that this remark is so crucial, so important, that it should not be just a remark, only one among so many in his very good book. It should be the starting point of everything. It should pervade everything. It should permeate every sentence of his book. And I think it was exactly that one of the best Western philosophers, a German philosopher called Edmund Husserl, did. He started from this remark and wrote not one book, 50 books, only about that, about the primacy of experience, about the contents of experience. He said something very wonderful. He said, as Descartes did before, consciousness is what is certain, and any object of consciousness can be a delusion. Well, and I could explain this to you, but now you know quite well. This table could be just a hologram. The snake could be a rope, but the experience of the snake is a reality here again. So Edmund Husserl started from this idea. Okay, so I will skip some slides. So now, this being granted, the fact that experience is absolutely crucial, that experience is primary, that experience is what is most certain, then we can suddenly realize that science, by its very method, has a blind spot in it, that it doesn't notice, as any blind spot goes unnoticed. And in order to understand that, you can, for instance, read the wonderful sentence of Wittgenstein. Nothing in the visual field allows you to infer that it is seen by an eye. The seer doesn't see itself. The eye doesn't see itself in the visual field. For instance, in the picture here, you could see the eye in the third-person point of view. But when you see something, you do not see the eye. You just see the landscape. The seer doesn't see itself. This is a famous saying that goes very long ago, that was said in the Upanishad. There is seeing, but seeing is not seen. Now, as Nishida Kitaro, the Japanese philosopher, a Zen Buddhist Japanese philosopher, noticed, it's exactly the same for science. There is the eye of science, but the eye of science is not seeing itself. As soon as one has adopted the standpoint of objective knowledge, he said, the knower doesn't enter in the visual field. The knower, the seer, consciousness is forgotten. It's through consciousness that we are aiming at objects, but consciousness is lost to sight. And therefore, he said, he concludes, Nishida Kitaro, therefore, the world of science is not the world of the true reality. What did he mean by that? He just meant that there is an aspect of reality, not an aspect actually, the most fundamental, the most obvious aspect of reality, which is experience, which is just lost to sight in favor of its objects. Okay, if we accept that, then the complete picture changes. We no longer have a one-way relation between the brain, which is basic, and consciousness, which is derivative. We have a mutual relation between two things, which are the brain and consciousness. And moreover, this mutual relation is itself understood in experience. So we have what I could call the strange loop of the relations between the brain and consciousness. This strange loop was wonderfully expressed by Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher of the 20th century. Bertrand Russell said, "Men will urge that the mind is dependent upon the brain, or with equal with equal plausibility, that the brain is dependent upon the mind." Why did he say that? Okay, we know that there are experiments that show that there is correlation between the brain and the mind, and therefore we say that the mind is dependent upon the brain. But we know also that the brain is an object of our experience. So the relation is mutual. Let's make a little experiment together, here and now, about this strange loop. We see here a wonderful thing. We see a brain which is seen by an eye, and the eye is the eye of somebody who has a brain. And therefore, a picture of the brain is projected on the back of his or hers cortex, brain cortex, and then the person sees the brain. Now, we are seeing a brain which is seeing a brain. You see that? We are all outside the picture. We are seeing a brain who is seeing a brain. Wonderful. So now, who is seeing the picture just now, at this very moment? And I stop a little bit, and I'm sure somebody will tell me, "Oh, it's my brain which is seeing the brain which is seeing the brain." Maybe. Now, who is now willing to answer, "Oh, it's just my brain who is seeing the brain who is seeing the brain"? Okay, if I leave you one more second to think, you will answer again, "It's my brain." Yes, but if I stop you from thinking at this very moment where I said this to you, you can only dwell into your experience and say, "Wow." Therefore, even my belief that it's my brain who is seeing the brain who is seeing the brain is here and now a conscious experience. Conscious experience at the moment where you are thinking now that I am wrong is still conscious experience that I am wrong. You see?
You're just trying to confuse us.
No, I'm just bringing you back to what you are now at this very precise moment. Not a thinker, an experiencer. Even an experiencer of the thinking. So I think maybe, I could say so many other things. I think I should stop at this point, because even though it's very puzzling, it's very difficult, and I see that Chris is a little bit discomforted by that, it's the crucial point.
We're going to turn now to comments, perhaps by Mathieu. Do you have a remark or two that you'd like to make? Not right now, not so much? Okay.
Maybe
we can open it up a little bit more to conversation around these points of lived experience. I think maybe this is actually a point of contact. You know, if I may pose perhaps a question to you, Michel.
Yeah.
The experience we spoke about earlier in the day concerning subtle mind, subtle body, versus the normal mind and normal body. In both cases, one is really speaking about the experiences that are available through the sense capacities in the case of the normal mind and normal body, or through meditation, the cultivation of the capacities also for experience, for example, of interconnectedness or impermanence. Now, these are both experiences. I think what you may be suggesting, and I wanted to ask you about this, is that both would then have, if I understand correctly, equal standing, ontologically equal standing.
Yes, absolutely true, yeah.
so that the phenomena or experience of the sense world, which we easily share, is sort of given to us by our body and birth, is one domain of experience. The other is, however, not given to us immediately,
Yes.
but needs to be cultivated. Have you given thought to this question of validation? That which is given to us by the senses, it seems immediately easy to validate. One may need recourse to science to make that precise.
Yes.
But how does this proceed in the case of contemplative experience, meditative experience?
Validate, well,
Could we have Michelle's microphone on again?
yeah. Validate contemplative experience, I think it's not the same problem as validating a certain scientific experiment. I think that in that case, you have to make a specific experience of suddenly realizing, for instance, that whatever belief you have is just an object of thought. And that there is something which is more primary, much deeper than this object of thought. It is the fact of having the experience of this object of thought. When you can stabilize this realization, I think you are not very far from a contemplative state.
Christoph, I think you had a comment you wanted to
I'm
make.
still confused, finally, when all is said and done. What you seem to be saying that... Hello?
Yeah.
So I'm just a simple working scientist, okay? And you confuse me. But
I'm glad.
What you seem to be saying is that consciousness is primary, and I agree, but that consciousness and the brain are intimately linked, and that if I don't have a brain, I can't have consciousness. Is that true?
Yes, but if I don't have consciousness, I don't have a brain either.
Yeah, okay, so then what we're doing is perfectly fine. We study the brain, we study brain mechanism to understand conscious experience. So then everything we said is fine, right?
I think your work is perfectly fine. What I challenge is your interpretation of your work, namely your metaphysical interpretation of your work, which is physicalism or materialism, which is a philosophical doctrine that I think is not warranted by your work.
But you're not saying anything else. You're saying you need a brain to be conscious. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, but
I think so.
Yes.
Yes, but you need a consciousness to see that you have a brain.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, just one second. I wonder if Your Holiness wants to jump in. This question.
Yes, His Holiness was saying that he too didn't fully confused.
Let me see if I can. Mathieu, let's go to Mathieu for a moment. Sorry, Your Holiness.
His Holiness feels that sometimes there is a tendency among scientists and philosophers that when we are successful in a very particular specific area, and we get kind of quite enamored by this, and then we start applying kind of more universally.
Generalizing.
Generalizing it. So
I think that's a mistake. I think some consciousness, I think they produced by cell. Some cell produced by consciousness. I think that's my view.
Activation.
And I think the very word of consciousness still not very clear. Mind or consciousness in Canada.
Mental.
Mental, what is still.
See,
I think we need, further sort of the proper sort of
definitions, working
or
definitions. So maybe we also might need to be very clear about what we mean by specific terms, and we might even need, new terms.
it's good, yeah.
Also one quotation in his presentation, using your word, without consciousness, then nothing. right? Then before human beings start, no world, no sun. Experience of sun, that's okay. Did he? Experience in consciousness. Did he? That's true. That's true. Perhaps image. Right? No. That is
Perception
number
and
one.
experience.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. That is true.
So maybe I can just show you the possibility of making neuroscience which is relevant to consciousness and yet is not reductionist or it's not materialist. This is exactly what Francisco Varela was trying to do. He didn't want to have an objective science of subjectivity. He wanted to have a science that cultivates both the objective and the subjective standpoints and connect them. He didn't want to grasp one into the other. He wanted to relate the two things. And I think it's what you are doing, but you do that.
Is it like the rope yesterday? The two ropes?
Yes, but it's a methodological rope in that case. It's not, they are not entities. They are just two standpoints. The standpoint of the first person and the standpoint of the third person. And he wanted to connect the two and create a new science of consciousness on this basis. So it's the same as you are doing, but without the materialist assumption. That's it.
That's you.
Yeah, often we say we should come back to common sense. So there's many sophisticated we can investigate, and the correlate between the brain and subjective experience is a complex subject. That's clear. But now, what is most immediate, most simple, a little bit what Michel was saying, is whether if I'm sad, basically I can still relate to basic nature of consciousness. If I am happy, I can relate to nature of consciousness. If I look at Buddha Shakyamuni's statue, I can do that. If I close my eye, I can do so. So in any case, no matter what happens, that's for sure. That experience, I can relate to that. Now, as a human being, I see things in certain ways, which is very complex, which I can describe in many ways. That's the interaction of that experience with the phenomenal world. Now, it's very clear that a blind person, a deaf person will have a different perception of the world, and suppose some other forms of life, like a bat who never sees but has goes with the ultrasound. When a bat looked at a flat ocean or ocean with big waves, we have no idea. No idea. But if the bat has some consciousness, let's imagine basic thing, that experience is there. So actually this is the most common denominator, that we can be assured that no matter what, we begin with that. So it seems pretty common sense. So the rest we can sort of try to explore all the relation, how does it work. We might be stuck at some point, but one thing is sure, that we have this primary experience. So at least to acknowledge that fully, I think will be a good starting point.
Richie, would you like to respond to the conversation?
There is one issue.
One time with Varela, this is the definition of sentient being. As a result of our discussion, then finally, you see, he mentioned anything which independently can move some distance. So that belongs to sentient being. There is some kind of sort of feeling, experience. So desire, move. So the smallest sentient being is amoeba. One is the
Amoeba.
amoeba. Very, I think, very
small organism.
very small
Yeah.
cell or
Single
very
cell.
small cell 가져왔다.
Yeah.
Yes.
A primitive, yes,
Primitive.
primitive cell, but you can move independently. So that belongs sentient being.
Well, one issue which I think is germane to this discussion, which really hasn't been raised explicitly yet, and actually is an issue that Francisco brought to our attention, which is one part of his solution to this methodological problem. And it relates to an issue that Christoph brought up, which is the issue that much of our behavior, much of what the brain generates, we're actually not conscious of. Christoph used the term zombie to describe that. We can be doing something very automatically and not be aware of it. Well, when
The assumption to 매와.
나는
그런 미세 매치죠. Yes.
when many people are asked to reflect on their experience, to actually give a conscious report, and have not been familiarized with their own mind, I would like to suggest that they're actually behaving also like zombies. So even though they are telling you that something is such and such is their conscious report, that is, they're experiencing something, they may actually just be reporting in a very automatic way about their theory, their implicit theory about what may be occurring, or telling, confabulating, making up a story. They're not actually consulting and interrogating their own mind.
Yeah.
And the project of bringing together the subjective and objective in the way that this quote of Francisco's describes depends upon a person who is able to actually provide a veridical report of their conscious experience. And in order to do that, I think requires some familiarity with their own mind.
So His Holiness was, actually responding to this reference to zombie-like behavior. He was saying that in some situations, although it may seem like a totally unconscious processes that you are engaging in, it's partly because you have so internalized those kind of activity, so that you don't no longer need to pay any conscious attention to the process. It just comes out of habit.
That's true, but the very act of doing that in so many different domains repeatedly affects your ability to respond to a question which requires you to interrogate your own mind. So, for example, psychologists like to give out questionnaires that ask a person to rate their subjective well-being. That is, on average, how satisfied are you with your own life? And people tend to give a report in response to those kinds of questions, which often doesn't reflect what's actually going on in their mind. And this is it is these kinds of biases in how people respond to those kinds of questions that Daniel Kahneman, Your Holiness met Daniel Kahneman, I believe, at the MIT meeting, received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his research on these kinds of biases in decision making.
There are two ways that this particular issue that Richie has been speaking about has been attempted to be dealt with. One, of course, is through familiarizing yourself with your own mind through meditative practice of the sort that Francisco advocated and did himself. But there's another second person or a dialogical method which is being explored now with some systematic way outside Paris or in Paris. And maybe, Michel, you could say just a word about this way of exploring the mind with the help of a partner.
Yes, Richie, you have said very rightly that in general, when one asks somebody to answer a question about one's own experience, usually the person answers with a sort of abstraction, thought, or even imaginative narration, instead of really sticking to one's own experience. On the other hand, it's possible by a careful process of interview, which is very similar, in fact, to the contemplative process, to induce a state in which the person sticks very narrowly to one's own experience and really speaks about one's own experience rather than on any abstraction about experience. And recently, my colleague Claire Petit-Mangin has finished a paper which is ready to be published, showing that when one uses this method, any confabulation can be completely overcome and one have a reliable description of one's own experience.